our sharing. All right, welcome and thank you everybody for taking the time to attend this transition talks at 12. Again, Jessica Knutsen will be talking about secondary transition planning. These sessions are hosted by two different agencies. One is the Northern Lights Interagency Council and the other is the Interagency Coordinating Council of Duluth. And we're proud to provide this series to you. It's never too early to start thinking about life after high school. So that's why we're glad you're here. Our focus is to provide information, tools, support for you as you look ahead at your child's future. So make some connections today. Feel free to ask questions when we have an opportunity to do that, or you can chat them in if you don't feel comfortable unmuting, and I can relay those to Jess. All this information is on our website as well on that Tuesday Transition Talks at 12. All right, with that, I am going to stop sharing, and Jess, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, so I will share my screen. All right, I'm assuming everyone can see that. Okay, Shannon, looks okay?
Looks great.
Awesome. All right, well, thank you everyone and welcome. Like Shannon said, I'm super excited to have you guys here. I know taking time in the middle of the day can be challenging, so I appreciate you being able to do that. And my hope is to get through this in an hour, but I have a lot of information in here. I'm super passionate about this area, so I tend to always put in way more than is necessary, but it is for your reference as well to access the recordings afterwards. So my name is Jessica Knutsen, and I am the Secondary Transition Coordinator for Northern Lights Special Ed Cooperative. And we work with 13 area school districts, basically everyone outside of Duluth, all the way up to Silver Bay, and then out west to McGregor, and down as far south as Willow River. So my role as the Secondary Transition Coordinator is to work with and support and advise teams on the planning, programming, and implementing the necessary components when preparing students for their future. And then prior to my role with Northern Lights, I had spent 8 years at East High School in Duluth as a special education teacher. So I've spent a lot of time working with secondary age students and transition planning. And I'd just be curious if you wouldn't mind putting in the chat what districts your children are in. It would just be good information for us to have on who's attending today. So if you wouldn't mind doing that throughout this presentation. So today, my hope for you is to provide a foundation of the components related to transition planning and give you some tools and things to consider when you're looking ahead into your child's future. So oftentimes the future for young adults with disabilities can really seem uncertain and can seem really daunting, trying to figure out and navigate the school system, home life, and then as well as other agency supports that may come on board. So many times families such as yourselves have spent a lot of years researching, negotiating, and advocating for services and supports for your child. And the thought of doing that all over again in a new system of adulthood services can really seem exhausting. So my hope is to help provide some resources and tips and strategies for you. So my biggest tip for you is just being proactive and starting to plan as early as possible with helping support your child with transitioning into adulthood. And if you find yourself in a position today where you have an older child and are close to finishing high school, that is okay as well. It's never too late to start planning for their future. So, and like Shannon said, if any time you have a question or comment, please feel free to add it into the chat. My plan is to kind of stop at each section of the presentation, and if you want to ask the question, we can certainly address that then. Otherwise, my email is at the bottom of the presentation as well, and you can always feel free to email me with any questions or comments. I typically don't like to read slides when giving a presentation or being on the other end and listening to someone present that reads the slides verbatim. However, I feel with this slide, It's really important as it has a clear message regarding transition planning. So I'm just going to break my own rule for one slide, I promise. So transition is not just added on to the IEP. Transition is not a service added on at the end of a student's high school career. Secondary transition planning is the focus of the IEP beginning during grade 9 and addresses both academic and functional skills. So transition is an ongoing process as students move from adolescence to adulthood. It's not a one and done conversation. So the transition process should involve continuous assessment, continuous planning and instruction, and evaluating in order to prepare them for adulthood. It requires students and parents and teachers to consider their current and future environments, including work, post-secondary education, and independent living. So what also must be considered are the skills that will be required to perform successfully in those environments. So not only do you look at the post-school outcomes of the student, but also what are the necessary steps for them to attain in order to be successful with their vision for their future. One thing I do want to note specifically about Minnesota is that once students enter 9th grade, all students are required to have what is called a personal learning plan. The acronym PLP is used a lot in schools. However, if a student has an IEP, that does meet the components of a personal learning plan. So basically all students in high school in the state of Minnesota have a basic life plan for them. And it's part of that whole college and career readiness. That's the emphasis. So my first section of the presentation is just going to briefly go over the transition process. And the biggest thing, like I said before, it's never too early to start thinking about transition. And I always like to phrase it this way. If you were to think of planning to move from your current location to another for a new job, when would you start preparing? Would you wait until the last minute to decide which area you would move to, or would you explore options now? So chances are most of us would probably do quite a bit of research, comparing cities, looking at different neighborhoods, looking at different schools for our children, considering all those possibilities, and ponder that information for a period of time. And it pays to plan ahead, even if it's well into the future. And that same holds true for transition planning. So even though your child might not leave high school for several years, they still benefit from early planning. Transition planning really teaches a process. It teaches a way of thinking, of setting goals for students, evaluating their strengths and interests and skills, and helps them really determine what they want to do and how to get there. In my experience, too often, parents feel like transition really sneaks up on them, leaving them really feeling unprepared to deal with that new world of adult services, or lack of, and not equipped to make those most informed choices. So, like I said, the earlier that you can plan, the better you will feel regarding your child's future. The next couple of slides are going to seem a little defeating, and that's not my point. My rationale for showing these is to review over the statistics, to first illustrate the facts, and secondly, to provide you with an understanding for the basis of some significant law changes and really the progressive movement regarding transition planning and preparing students to be college and career ready. I mean, basically, when you're looking at these statistics, it's showing a comparison of students with disabilities and those without, and looking at the success rate in terms of enrolling in college, successfully completing college, attaining and maintaining employment, and then also living as independently as possible. And a few years ago, back in 2014, there was a recent legislation called the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. And that creation was to help ensure students with disabilities that they gain the skills and have the experiences that lead to success in competitive integrated employment. And that's a really big phrase right now, is that competitive integrated employment. And what I mean by that is basically having a job where you're earning minimum wage or more. So under this umbrella was the creation of what are called pre-employment transition services. So for students starting in 9th grade and beyond, schools are collaborating with vocational rehabilitation services to provide students with disabilities job exploration counseling, work-based learning opportunities, counseling about post-secondary options, workplace readiness training, self-advocacy instruction, and then independent living skills. There's quite a bit of support that voc rehab is providing schools and students that have disabilities. And I don't want to go into too much detail about some of these law changes because on March 16th and April 20th, we will have vocational rehab services from both Northern Lights and Duluth Public Schools presenting on this information, along with kind of what work-based learning looks like in the schools for each of these districts. Post-secondary transition planning in schools right now has really been successful in closing a lot of these gaps and has really helped students with disabilities fulfill their post-school outcomes in terms of work, independent living, and community participation. So the result has been a number of improvement in those post-school outcomes. We're seeing higher employment rates. We're seeing more enrollment and successfully completing post-secondary education for youth with disabilities. And some of the really kind of cool things happening within the state of Minnesota is we're seeing a lot more integration of post-secondary programs for students with intellectual disabilities, such as the Minnesota Independence College and Community, which used to be called Minnesota Life College, based out of Richfield, Minnesota. There's the Bethel University Build program. Central Lakes College in Brainerd has an occupational skills program. And currently right now, St. Cloud State University is designing a program for students with intellectual disabilities. And those students are students with developmental disabilities, students that may be on the spectrum or have learning disabilities. So there's a wide variety of students that could potentially fit the criteria for those programs. The major components of transition. So for students in grade 9, the IEP will continue to address the academic, functional, and behavioral needs. However, this is where we see kind of a switch at this stage. And now we're also linking those goals to the areas of transition. So we're looking at that academic, functional, and behavioral components and tying that in with a student's vision of where they want to be in terms of employment, any type of post-secondary education and training they may need, and living as independently as possible. So secondary transition is guided both by federal and state law, which means there's specific requirements for the IEP team in terms of who participates, assessments that need to be completed, the implementation of what are called measurable post-secondary goals, and I'll go into more detail about those, and then also links to adult services that will and could benefit the student. So this process really involves supporting the student to identify their vision for their future and expanding your role as a family as well. I like to use this visual a lot when doing presentations with special education teachers because I think it really gives a good visual of the transition process. And I like to think of transition planning as kind of backward chaining or backward planning. So you're starting with where the student sees themselves in the future, their goals in terms of a career, where they want to live, what they want to do. And then you look at how are we going to help get them there? So we're looking at what are the goals that can be implemented in the IEP? What are some transitional needs we can identify? What are some classes they could take in high school to help them reach their goal? What are some of the specialized instruction that we could provide? And then also looking at adding in those other supports or services or linkages, which some of us are used to maybe having county supports or vocational rehab services as an example. I want to briefly go over a couple ways that school districts are measured based on the transition part of special education. And there's actually 4 indicators that are measured, and I'm only going to talk about 2. The other 2 I'm not going to talk about that districts are measured are graduation rates and the dropout rate. But the 2 specifically I'm going to talk about today are tied to everything that we're going to talk about in terms of an IEP. This first one is called indicator 13, and basically the meaning behind this indicator is to ensure engagement of youth and prepare them for post-secondary education, training, employment, and independent living. So everything you see on this slide are the parts of an IEP that secondary transition needs to address. And we're going to go into more detail with this throughout the presentation. So we want to assure that every student in special education, starting in 9th grade and beyond, have these components addressed within their IEP. The other area is what is called indicator 14. So every year, school districts are obligated to complete what is called a post-school outcome survey. And this is basically an interview format that happens hopefully with the student or young adult at that time, or the family member. And what this information looks at is, it's looking at, is the student competitively employed, and are they enrolled in any type of post-secondary school? And it breaks it down even further. It asks basically like what their hourly rate is. It looks at how long have they been employed, or how long have they been in a post-secondary school. And it provides school districts with information in terms of what is being done in terms of programming in schools, and how does that relate to where students end up as an adult. An example I can think of, students who participate in a work-based learning experience. So they're out in the community while in high school working. Is there a relationship to those students then being able to be competitively employed? And there is data to show that that is true, versus a student that hasn't participated in any work experience. So a lot of this information from this survey helps school districts and the state kind of design programming for students with disabilities and their future. All right, before I move on to the next section, does anyone have any questions or comments?
We did have one question in the chat, and it may be addressed to Martha as well. Does Duluth have post-secondary education for special needs?
Hi, this is Martha. I can certainly answer this. I'm with Duluth Public Schools Special Ed Department, and I'm a teacher on special assignment and do a lot with post-secondary. I worked with Jess when she was with us at East High School for years, but we certainly
Martha,
hear.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Martha, but we're having a little bit of problem with your sound again. I wonder if you don't share your video, maybe it'll be better. Thank you.
Okay, how's that?
That's
Is this any better?
Yep.
Okay, thanks for that reminder. Martha Lippett with Duluth Public Schools Special Ed Department. And yes, everything you're hearing here from that Jess is speaking for you, we do the same types of things with the IEPs, and as far as hooking people up with services and agencies within Duluth for after high school. So yes, we do in both of our high schools have programming and education in these areas.
Great, thank you. I don't see any more in the chat, but feel free to put questions in there.
Okay. All right, the next section I'm going to talk about is regarding transition assessments. And this is really the foundation that identifies the needs of the student and their goals. So within secondary transition, once students enter into 9th grade, transition assessments are required. So a lot of times you may see in middle school, secondary transition is a part of an evaluation or reevaluation for your child. If that hadn't happened and a student enters into 9th grade without that done, sometime during that 9th grade year, a transition assessment does need to be completed so that those components of the IEP are addressed. And the assessments really provide the foundation for students to identify their strengths and needs and preferences that will be used to establish their post-school goals. And a lot of times assessment data serves as that common thread in transition process and forms the basis for defining those goals and services in the IEP. So I always think of that assessment is the strongest foundation we have for that student when we're then creating the programming and looking ahead into their future. So the information that's collected from the transition assessment really helps the team identify the student's skills, the behaviors they'll need, and the knowledge a student will have in order to be successful in any type of post-secondary education training, in independent living, and along with employment as well. So simply put, the assessment process is about getting from here, where the student is currently functioning. So we're getting a snapshot of where they're at in this moment in time and looking to the there or their future. So I'll just quickly kind of go over a little description of each of these transition areas that we can focus on. So the first area that we look at with students is the area of employment. And so this involves a lot of the career planning process. So for example, does the student have an understanding of the benefits of work? Do they demonstrate appropriate work skills currently, even though they don't have a job, maybe with what they do at home in terms of chores or helping out, or in school if they have some tasks, would those carry over into an employment setting? And also looking at maybe applying that understanding and skills in work-based learning experiences. So that's where they can practice some of those skills. The other area is post-secondary education and training. And I want to really make it clear that this doesn't just mean a 2 or 4 year college. It encompasses all forms of training needed in order for a student to meet their employment goal. So it could be military, it could be apprenticeships, it could be volunteer experiences, it could be the Peace Corps, AmeriCorps, on-the-job training. It can include a wide variety of options for students. And within independent living, so there's technically really 5 areas of transition. So there's employment, post-secondary education, training, and independent living. And with that independent living are 3 others incorporated into that. And that's home living, recreation and leisure, and community participation. And we just kind of put that all under the category of independent living. And what the independent living looks at are the skills needed to be successful within the home and within the community. So teaching the student skills to be successful in daily living activities, looking at personal management, social interactions, safety in the community, understanding self-advocacy. The list can go on in this area in terms of independent living. So some of the things to think of in terms of the best practices and questions. So transition assessments are really intended to look at the students' hopes, dreams, and aspirations. And as adults and as the team, we look at supporting them in their visions and helping guide them along. And all too often, special education really may seem to focus on what a student cannot do or really identifies their deficits. And the beauty of transition assessments is that it provides an opportunity to look at what the student can do, what they're interested in, and what they want for themselves. So it really provides the student to have a voice. Another amazing part of transition assessments is that it's okay if a student answers, I don't know, to questions about what they want to do or thinking about how am I going to get there. So when a student answers, I don't know, what this really reveals is that we need to offer more help and support in that area. So it really provides an opportunity for the team to do some further career exploration or some other self-discovery activities to help that student explore their strengths, interests, and preferences. So the beauty of secondary transition, and I missed that part when I was a teacher, is you could see the student kind of discovering who they are and looking at their strengths and potentially what they could be doing as an adult. So with parent participation in the process, I always strongly encourage teachers to not only talk to the student about their visions for their future and currently their skills that they're possessing and how that relates to their visions, but really getting parent input, because you know your child better than anyone else does. And you can provide a lot of valuable information to the team in terms of what your child is currently doing at home, what you see as their strengths, maybe what you see as some of the struggles, because a lot of times we see discrepancy with how a student functions at home versus how a student functions in school. So it's nice to kind of get that holistic picture from parents as well. Any questions that have come up during that section of the presentation, or anyone wants to ask something right now? Or Martha, if you want to add anything too.
I do have one question, and if the gentleman feels comfortable jumping in online for sure, because I may not be reading this correctly. He is wondering what options are available in colleges in Duluth or Superior for students with special needs. So options available in college, and I wasn't quite sure what options.
It was me, and it's actually Lila. I don't know how to change it when my kids are using the Zoom on here, so it just goes to his name every time I'm on there, but whatever. I'm Lila Hansmeyer, and I'm wondering what college options are available. You suggested some in the cities and other places, but are there college options up here like LSC where they help or work with special needs students?
All colleges, even up here, will work with students that have disabilities. The colleges I mentioned that were more towards the cities are specifically designed for students with more mild to moderate intellectual disabilities. But for example, like Lake Superior College up here, UMB St. Scholastica, they also have disability coordinators that can support students in terms of following through on accommodations. It never hurts to go to, granted we have a pandemic right now, but when hopefully that's over and done, to take a college tour or go meet with a disability coordinator and talk about, is this the right fit for me? We don't have anything specifically up here similar to like what the cities has or Brainerd has yet. There is talks, and has been for a few years, from both Scholastica and Lake Superior College of trying to offer some programming similar to what is offered in the cities. Does that help, Lila?
Yes, it does. I'm sorry, I forgot to turn off my mute or turn on my mute or whatever it is.
Good, thank you.
No other questions right now, Jess.
Okay. So the next part of the presentation, I want to go over the IEP process. And I'm sure you're all familiar with sitting in some IEP meetings. So I want to really hone in on the parts of the IEP that address secondary transition. And so at any time, if you have any questions, please feel free to add that in the chat. And Shannon, you can just stop me too, because this is a more lengthy section. So like I've stated before, secondary transition focuses on what the student's life will look like following high school. So we're really asking those questions on where they see themselves after they have graduated high school. And so that planning process of gathering the information about their strengths, interests, and hopes, and where they're currently functioning and their identified needs is the foundation of the IEP. And I'm biased with my role as the secondary transition coordinator, but a lot of times when I'm attending IEPs for ninth graders, I can't articulate enough that transition is the starting point when having an IEP meeting. But the students' visions for life after high school should be where we're starting that IEP meeting, and from there designing the rest of that IEP. So I can go into more detail on what that looks like as well. So this visual looks at the 6 components of transition planning. So we briefly talked about some of those transition assessments. So we can't really plan appropriately if we don't conduct appropriate and age-appropriate transition assessments. So once we've gathered information from those assessments in terms of the students' interests, strengths, and preferences, and they've identified some visions for their future, we can then help support them in looking at designing that programming for them. So specifically looking at what courses of study will help them, implementing some transition services that are going to help them as well, and then redesigning those annual IEP goals and objectives that are going to help them reach their vision for their future. And then also looking at how can we involve any adult agencies that could support students. And it may not be appropriate for all students, so it's very individualized. So federal law requires that an IEP includes those measurable post-secondary goals. So, however, when you think back to being in high school or when we were younger, how many of us knew exactly what we wanted to do in high school? And if we did know, did we do the planning for that while in high school? And some of us may have changed our minds multiple times, or maybe we're in a position right now where we're still trying to figure out what we want to do as an adult. So the beautiful thing of students who have IEPs is there's a really huge support network to help them with planning for their future. And the one thing that we have to remember, and when we think back to when we were younger, is our minds were forever changing and evolving. So that's why it's really important, even though a student in 9th grade may say they want to be an astronaut, that we review that every year at that IEP meeting, because things change. So as students progress through high school, these goals should become more specific as well. So for example, let's say we have a student who's in 9th grade that is interested in building something or building things. And that's about as specific as they have for a vision for a job for themselves. Hopefully by 12th grade, if they stayed consistent with their interests, we would see something in terms of a post-secondary goal of they're going to join the carpentry apprenticeship program and become an interior finisher. So that becomes really specific, and that's kind of the progression or continuum we like to see. Is starting in the 9th grade, it may be pretty vague, and we're doing a lot of career exploration, self-awareness, self-discovery, and by the time they're a senior, they've really honed in on something specific they want to attain. So when we're looking at these measurable post-secondary goals, it's really looking at, in terms of the employment pieces, what vocation do they want to pursue? What setting do they want to work in? And we want to look at not just the job site on where they want to work, but what they want to do. So what I mean by that is we want to see these goals say something to the effect of they will work as a daycare assistant versus they will work at a daycare. So we want them to look at a profession and not just that job site. And the post-secondary education and training, like I said, isn't just college. You're looking at, if they want to be a carpenter, what training are they going to need to reach that? And so it's looking at joining an apprenticeship, or it could be going to Lake Superior College and looking at their carpentry program there. So there's a variety of options that students could look at. And so our job is to help support them in understanding all of the options so that they could make those informed choices. And the last area is independent living, and this is as appropriate for the students. So looking at their vision of where do they want to live? Who do they want to live with? How are they going to commute within their community? What supports will they need to live independently? Will they need supports with managing their finances, managing their health care? What do they see themselves doing in terms of rec and leisure, participating in the community? So those are some of the bigger topics under that umbrella of independent living. And this just gives just a look at the options for post-secondary education. A lot of times meetings that I join when we talk about post-secondary education, people immediately think just a 2 or 4 year college. So I really want to emphasize that it's not just that. It can be, but there's a lot more options available in terms of that training piece. The next few slides are just some examples. So if you can recall, when you're looking at your child's IEP, there is a page on there that looks at their post-secondary goals, and then on there it also has the courses of study that the team has helped them figure out. So these are some examples of what those goals can look at like. So remembering it is their vision for after high school, and that could be a year, a 5 year, 10 years down the road after they've completed high school. And we always talk about first, when I graduate high school or after high school, I will do this. So the one thing to keep in mind is it's based on their interests and preferences and should be attainable. That's something that we could actually observe them doing. And we do come across situations where a student has a goal, let's say becoming a professional football player or a rapper or a YouTube star. But then we look at, they haven't ever played school football. They haven't participated in music class, or they really struggle with using technology. So it's a real balancing act for a lot of times for special education teachers on helping students identify what they want to do, but also feeling like at times they are a dream crusher. And when I work with teams, a lot of times I look at those interests that the student has identified and kind of go into the differences between what's a hobby and what's a vocation. Because a lot of times students are interested in football or being a rapper or a YouTube star because it looks cool and they enjoy spending their time doing that. And that could be a hobby. Whereas maybe we need to look at what could be a vocation where it's more attainable and we'll earn a living doing that. This next area is just looking at that post-secondary education and training piece, just some examples for you to look at. I think it's really important to have discussions with your child on what they think they need for training in order to attain their vocation of their dreams. So there's so many options for them. And the special education teacher can also help them identify some of those as well. So these again are just some examples that you would hope to see on your child's IEP. And the last area is the independent living. So this isn't required to have this addressed on an IEP. So it depends on the needs of the student from that evaluation. So if we see that the student needs some support in this area, we would most likely see a post-secondary goal. And with this, I'm always looking at, youth, and we want them to be as independent as possible. And so what skills are they going to need to acquire, and what supports are they going to need in place to help them be as independent as possible? Within the present levels of performance of the IEP, and so that's probably the more lengthy narrative of an IEP. What we do want to see is that all 5 areas of transition are addressed, and remembering the 5 areas of transition are employment, post-secondary education and training, community participation, home living, and recreation and leisure. And a lot of this information comes from the students' special education evaluation, but is updated every year. So at some point, yourself can provide input at the IEP meeting, or that special education teacher is working with that student to get updated information in terms of how they're functioning at home, how they're functioning in school, maybe in 9th grade, they didn't have a job and now in 10th grade, they're working. So updating that information within that plaque is really important because it does give us that snapshot, that moment in time of how they're currently functioning. And this really justifies the need for the IEP goals in the IEP in and of itself. So from the present levels, we want to address those needs. Courses of study are really important. When students enter into high school, there are district or state requirements in terms of credits they have to earn in order to graduate. But also with being an IEP, there is some flexibility with the classes that students can take. But what we want to see with the courses of study is an alignment to their vision for their future. So when we look at the classes that we're helping the student choose or pick from, we want to look at how is this class going to help them be that carpenter, help them be that daycare assistant, or help them become that teacher. And at times it can be challenging depending on the course offerings, but we really want to see the classes complement the student's vision for their future. And for students with more moderate to severe disabilities, a lot of times they're in more functional type class settings within the special education room. So I always advise teams to just look at, instead of listing the classes such as a functional math or functional English, to list out some of those skills that are being worked on within that classroom. And that really gives a good picture of those components that the student is working on. I'll take a little break right here. Are there any questions that have come up or comments?
I don't see anything in the chat, but feel free if anybody wants to unmute and ask a question, go for it.
All right, I'll keep plugging along. I have a ton more and I only have 15 minutes. I'm looking at the clock.
I got a quick question. I know like when in the regular classes in about 9th grade in ESCO, they have, they do a lot of interest tests and all that kind of thing. Do they do that in the special ed classes too? In like
Yes.
around 9th grade?
Yes, they do. And
Okay.
I always encourage as much as possible to have students participate in the general education setting where they could get that information in there as well and be with their peers and have that. But yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
So I briefly mentioned flexibility with graduation requirements. So there is a lot of power that comes with an IEP once students enter into high school, which can be a really good thing. And I want to briefly talk about some of that. So there's different options to consider for a student in terms of their path towards graduation. So they can earn the typical requirements that a district or the state requires. There could be some modifications of credit requirements, or there could be the route of a student graduating based on the successful completion of their IEP goals and objectives. So I want to just talk about the course substitutions right now. So when we look at substituting classes, basically what that means is we're kind of going off the rails in terms of this is what the district's requiring for graduation. And we're going to modify that and say, instead of a student taking a world history class, I feel, and we feel as a team, it's better for them to participate in work-based learning and increase their employment skills. And that's going to help them attain their post-school vision. So as a team, we look at their vision for their future and what are the most appropriate classes for them. And it's really important you have the whole team there to help make these decisions. One thing I always want people to be aware of is the impact when you're substituting classes, especially with a student's long-range plans. So there may be always a chance that the student will change their mind. And let's say maybe they just wanted to enter right into the employment world after high school, and then a year later decide, nope, I'm gonna go into a 4-year college or a 2-year college. And we've substituted classes. So we want to be cautious with that because, as we know, looking at entering into some post-secondary programs, there are requirements that have to be met while in high school. So it puts a little bit of more pressure on the team in terms of, is the student really sure, is your child really sure this is what they want to do? But I always encourage teams too that it's okay, because there's always different routes of getting to post-secondary education if they didn't meet those requirements in high school. And a lot of times for students with significant disabilities, they're not looking at participating in a world history or economics or literature classes. They're more looking at acquiring and maintaining those functional skills and activities of daily living and transition. So their program is more of that IEP driven program. So with the IEP driven diploma, most times you see this for a small percentage of students. So students that are potentially at risk of dropping out, or students, like I said, with significant disabilities, and then also on an individual basis, their circumstances to use the IEP driven diploma. So basically, we're looking at the skills. What are the skills the student should acquire in order to graduate from high school or exit out of high school? So looking at some ideas could be the social skills needed to be successful on the job. Do they have a plan? Do they need to be linked up with some agencies prior to graduating high school? Do they understand the resources available to them to help them support maybe with housing or recreational leisure activities? Transportation is another big one. Do we have a plan addressing the transportation piece? Maybe the student who needs their driver's license or needs to take their test, how can we help support that? And then knowledge of post-secondary options, if they have an interest in that or need some additional training for them to reach their employment goal, do they have an understanding of the route they will have to take to get there? So with an IEP driven diploma, students should be making progress throughout the year on their goals and objectives, and prior to graduation or exiting out, that they have met them. Anticipated graduation date is another big topic within the IEP meeting. The goal is always to have students graduate with their same age peers. However, this is based on a team decision. And I always encourage teams to look at what will it look like when the student is ready to graduate. And I ask parents that a lot. What do you want it to look like? What skills do you want your child to be able to demonstrate or possess that you feel they'll be ready? What agencies do you feel they need to be linked up with or connected with to have that support in terms of employment, post-secondary training, and independent living? And then will they be prepared to have the knowledge and skills to meet the visions that they have for them? So those are some big questions that I ask parents when we're looking at graduation. The other thing I want to talk about is the 18 to 21 transition programming. So decisions are typically made on a year-by-year basis as the IEP team really reviews over the student's progress on their goals and considers any type of agency linkages. So when you look at the programming for 18 to 21-year-olds, it's really not a continuation of high school, but it's a time period for completing transition and other goals. So students typically don't participate in the traditional high school classes that aren't related to their IEP goals and objectives. So what I mean by that is they're not taking an economics or maybe a literature class. They're focused more on if a goal on their IEP has to do with independent living and maybe cooking, they could participate. You could see them participating in a cooking class or a facts class. A lot of times the 18 to 21 programming doesn't have specific requirements for time or location because of the transition focus. Programming tends to be more community-based with a high degree of focus on the employment and independent living and the connections with adult resources. And it can be really varied as compared to the typical high school programming completed in 9th through 12th grade. So it really all depends on the individual student and the needs that are identified from that evaluation. So each school really has the ability to design an individualized transition program for students based on those needs documented in the eval and IEP. And one thing I want to note about students that can carry on into 18 to 21 programming is that they do have the right to participate in the graduation ceremony with their same age peers. The only thing is they wouldn't be able to attain their diploma until they've successfully completed the program or have aged out. But it's really important to understand that they do have the right to participate in the graduation ceremony with their same age peers. Martha, I don't know if you want to add anything in this area regarding Duluth's programming.
Duluth has two different programs for 18 to 21 transitional services like Jess is talking about. Ours are based on the students' needs, of course. And they are community-based as well. One of them has some classroom time and then goes out to the community with total support, students that can't learn to take the bus on their own or go to a job site, so they have job coaches with them, where our other program is more a bridge to life after high school and called the Bridge Program, where students might start out going on the bus and going to a job site with the job coach, but then the job coach backs off as they become more independent, and then it may be just a check-in, when they're already at their job. So again, these two programs were designed for the students' needs and are always full every year and have a great success for helping kids. Sometimes some of their job sites they go to actually will then, yes, employ them. So.
Thanks, Martha. The other pretty large portion of the IEP related to transition planning are what are called transition services. So these, I always think of these as like the golden nuggets or the sprinkles on a cake in terms of these are activities that can help support the student with their annual IEP goals. So the areas that transition services are a part of are instruction related services, community experiences, the development of those employment and post-school goals, and the acquisition of daily living skills. So I won't go into too much detail with this, but we look at, for that student that wanted to be a carpenter, so what instruction, what classes could they participate in? So we would see a student is going to participate in the Woods 1 class in their 9th grade year. Student is going to complete a job shadow experience with a carpenter for first semester, for example. Related services can talk a lot about currently what the student's getting in terms of related services in school, and then looking within the community. So a lot of times we'll see vocational rehabilitation services on here, especially if they're helping support the student with any work experience or some of those pre-employment transition services we talked about earlier in the presentation. Community experiences really look at those activities that are going to help that student function as independently as possible in the community. So you could see transportation discussed here. So maybe the student is learning about different modes of transportation or practicing taking the DTA, for example. Maybe they're participating in some community events or an after-school job, things like that. The development of employment and post-school goals look at some of those activities that will help the student prepare them for employment. So we might see learning how to write a resume, completing some job applications, understanding admission process to a post-secondary training program, doing some job shadowing. The acquisition of daily living skills is just how it sounds. So how are they going to do some activities that are going to help them improve on their daily living activities? So we may see a student participate in a daily fitness routine, or the team helps develop a sensory diet, learning about healthy relationships, learning about vocational assessments and identifying more of those strengths and needs. So again, these are just kind of added components, activities that can be done to help support that student with their post-school visions. Related to IEP goals, so when I talked about at the beginning of the presentation that, so as students are in elementary and middle school, you predominantly see IEP goals with an academic, functional, or behavior component. Once students enter into 9th grade, those can continue, but with the added component of addressing transition. So we look at a student that maybe does have a goal related to behavior management, and absolutely that goal applies to that student being able to function in a post-secondary environment, in an employment setting, and functioning as independently as possible in the community. So this slide just kind of gives, and it's not an end-all be-all list, but some IEP goal areas and how those could relate to those transition areas. Accommodations and modifications, I'll just briefly go over, but again, these are based off the needs identified in that special education evaluation. And I always encourage teams, like I said, to keep in mind that high expectations and access to the general education curriculum are really associated with higher outcomes for students with disabilities. More successful, and the data shows more successful within the employment area, more successful in the post-secondary setting, and more successful with independent living. And I always encourage teams that students progress through high school, and the hope is they become as independent as possible. So we want to see a reduction in the accommodations and modifications on that IEP. An example I can share is a student that maybe has a goal of entering into a post-secondary program. And we want to mimic those accommodations in high school that they're going to get in college. Because right now there's that safety net. So if something doesn't work or it becomes really difficult for them in high school, we can assist them and support them now versus when they're transitioning into that setting, they don't have as many of those supports. Or looking at students who utilize a paraprofessional. And when they transition into work or post-secondary setting or independent living, will they have that adult with them? Some individuals will, but there's others that we could potentially pull back more of those adult services and work on increasing more of that independence. I just wanted to share some of the big areas that I always stress with teams on to work on with students. And I talk about it's a team approach. So families, the school, and any agencies involved are, increasing those self-advocacy skills, that self-determination. And that's a really big one for students on being able to make their own decisions. And the hard part for them is understanding the consequences of some of those decisions. But it's really important for them to be an active member in the team. And then as well as those independent living skills. And again, we like to see that progression as they go through high school. I remember being in 9th grade and I relied on my parents for everything in terms of buying my clothes, buying my food, making my bed, taking me to doctor's appointments. And so we want to see us to progress, that we see them doing more of those things is the hope. So then that transition is a little smoother than abrupt for some. Student participation is really important. In 9th grade, students are required to attend the IEP meeting. And that doesn't always happen, and that's okay as well. But they are required to be there. And I really want to push parents to advocate for their child to be at that IEP meeting. And I consider that it probably isn't always a fun thing, and maybe hasn't been in the past, to be surrounded by a bunch of adults, and maybe it hasn't always been positive, but this really gives them that opportunity to share their strengths and interests, to talk about the challenges they face with their disability, and to look ahead in terms of their future. And this next slide, I just want to provide as a way to show how we could get students more engaged, because simply inviting them to an IEP meeting really isn't enough. we really need them to be an active member within their IEP meeting, whether that's they attend the meeting or actually speaking verbally about some of these things, or so I've seen some students actually do a PowerPoint and present it to the IEP team. So there's a bunch of different modalities that can be used to engage students more in their planning, but I really push teams to get students involved starting in ninth grade, and if not earlier, it would be better to even start this in middle school to have students be a part of those meetings and focusing on their strengths and interests and where they see themselves in the future. I'm just going to trudge through. I've got 2 more slides and then we'll wrap up if there's any questions. So the last part are agency linkages, and this is a really big component of transition planning as well, because you don't have to do it alone. Once students leave high school, they don't have to do it alone. And I always ask teams, what happens when that school door closes on that last day of school? What happens when that bus pulls away on the last day of school? What happens the next day after school is out for that young individual? We want to make sure that when they graduate or exit high school, that they are not just sitting at home and that they don't have the resources to get a job or get support for a job, or aren't doing any type of post-secondary education or training for a job that they are interested in, and hopefully aren't going to live at home forever, even though that may be the case for some, but we have a lot of individuals that could live independently. So I really push teams to look at those questions and ask yourselves that of how we can make sure those supports are in place. And a lot of times I use the analogy of a safety net. As parents, you're really accustomed to that school as that safety net. And some of you may have had the same special education teacher for years, especially in some of these smaller school districts. And so they know your child inside and out. And so while your child is still in high school, let's start building that next safety net. So whether that's county services, vocational rehab, maybe the Center for Independent Living, let's build that network now. So when your child graduates or ages out, those adult services are already in place and kick over instead of kind of an abrupt stop with things. Because if some of you have experienced it, it can take a while for some of those adult services to engage, and it's such a complex system. So I always encourage special education teachers, case managers, and they're really charged with sharing with families the services and agencies that are available to help support students. Any questions? And I apologize, this has gone over, but there's a lot of information, and I feel like this is a lot to do in an hour. So I appreciate you sticking with me for this.